Welcome back to the Exit Velo podcast. I'm Adam Cohen alongside Ben Rossi tonight. And Ben, lots of interesting baseball news that happened this week. And we also have the 2021 Hall of Fame ballot released as well. And we will certainly get into that. But first off, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing great. I mean, obviously saddened that there's no baseball right now, no baseball for a while, but I gotta be excited by the baseball news that keeps coming now. And it's just, despite everything that's going on, despite how we had the NBA draft, despite the heart of the NFL season, I like how I think baseball definitely deserves somewhat of a spotlight in the sporting world these past few weeks, especially given some of the news that we're going to start with tonight. Like, if you want, I can jump right in there.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, so first off, the news about Robinson Cano, again, suspended 162 games, again, testing positive for PEDs for the second time. I just don't know what this guy's doing for his career. I think his career might be done. He just provided so much excitement to the game, and it's just disheartening to see him another time violate MLB's PDE policy or perform PED policy. And I just really can't believe that this happened the second time for Cano. I thought this was kind of his chance at this point with the Mets to turn his career around again. It was kind of his last chance. And I just don't really see him having much of a career now ahead of this. What do you think about that news?
Well, I think he'll still return just because he has a couple years left on his contract and he's getting paid $24 million a year. That's pretty hard to say no to, but you hit a nail on the point in that it's so disappointing that he's essentially ruined his Hall of Fame case. He might have been one of the greatest Yankees all time at second base, if not the greatest. He was arguably the greatest second baseman in the 2000s, and he was a surefire Hall of Famer. Even with PEDs the first time, he probably could have still had a decent chance. The second time, it's ridiculous because the first time there was they added these more drugs to the PED list, and a couple players such as him and Jorge Polanco and D. Gordon, they're saying, well, we're not sure because these drugs are new and we didn't realize that they violate the protocol. But second time around, you obviously have to be careful. I mean, this guy played with A-Rod, he played with Clemens. He knows all the guys who took PEDs. He should have learned his lesson by now. Anybody at MLB should have learned their lesson by now. So there's really no excuse. And it's really to see someone who was such a lockdown first ballot Hall of Famer ruin his chances in an instant and just become a heartbreaker for New York.
Yeah, I just want to say, too, he was incredible. He was good on all dimensions of the game, incredible fielder. He could hit for average, he had good contact, but he also obviously had a lot of power, too. So he was just great on all dimensions, and it's just saddening seeing one of these more recent guys, especially with the whole PED case. I think it's going to hurt his Hall of Fame chances more than some of the other Hall of Fame chances of some of the earlier guys, we're going to talk about, Bonds and Clemens, who maybe didn't know better at the time.
Exactly. During the time, of course, everyone did PEDs, everyone did steroids as well, and those guys at least will have that going for them. But and it's even very tough for them because both of those guys have barely cracked 60%. And then you see players who are less than them, such as McGuire, who's not on the ballot anymore, but other players such as Sosa or Sheffield not get very high, or Palmeiro,
Manny.
who got off Manny, of course. And then A-Rod's going to, I believe, be on the ballot next year because he retired in 2016, and then down the road you'll have Robinson Cano. So it might be a lot more difficult for these guys because they were past that generation. A-Rod maybe the first time, but the second time, he was not a part of that. Same with Cano, too, and both times he did it. That's past the, okay, it's fine if you take PEDs because everyone else is saying not fine, of course, but it was at least somewhat understandable. That's no longer the case. And because of that, he might be, lingering 10% almost all his Hall of Fame or post-playing career.
Definitely. Yeah, you definitely nailed it right on the coffin there. That it's a lot more of the recent guys. Their chances should be hurt a little more. I mean, the MLB was actually testing when these guys were doing PEDs. By the time Manny was doing it, MLB had actually undergone testing. By the time Cano was doing it more recently, MLB had undergone testing. But Bonds and Clemens and a lot of the earlier guys, there's a lot more defense to them. I mean, if you deny guys even Mark McGuire a trip to the Hall of Fame. What really justifies putting some of these more recent guys who really should have known better in the Hall of Fame?
And we will get into it later, but Bonds and Clemens are the two best players who have taken PEDs, pretty much. You can add A-Rod in there as perhaps right behind them, but those two guys didn't get suspended twice, and they also are some of the best players ever to play the game at their position. So it's almost as if that they could get a green light into the Hall of Fame just for being the two best.
For sure. And now let's move on to the other news. Before we get into Hall of Fame stuff, the other big news today was one of the other big names in baseball, Theo Epstein, one of the great minds behind building this Cubs 2016 team that broke the biggest drought in baseball history, has resigned as Cubs general manager, even though he had 1 year left on his contract. He told USA Today, but the Cubs are due for retooling, perhaps even a full rebuild. And Epstein said in a statement released by the Cubs, he felt more comfortable leaving those decisions in his hands to Jed Hoyer, who is going to replace him as GM. And Epstein it's interesting. He believes that now is the right time for him to step down, while the Cubs might have to go through some ramifications for some of their moves and things like that, or go into like a new era of baseball that he thinks, I guess, now is the time to give it to Jed Hoyer instead of maybe waiting one more year. I was a little bit shocked about that. I don't know about you.
Pretty surprised by it as well, because first off, Epstein will be in the Hall of Fame. There's no doubt about that. He will be selected by the Veterans Committee when it's all said and done. And he might not even be out of baseball entirely, but this was a shocker because he not only helped the Cubs get over their drought, he helped the Red Sox get over their drought too. And he was only 30 at the time as a GM, and that's incredibly young as a GM. He broke tons of barriers by that regard. He really brought in this Yale model archetype of being a statistician and just utilizing sabermetrics as well. And he implemented that with the Red Sox and the Cubs. So he's one of the best 21st century GMs, of course, and he really has paved the way for many other analytical GMs. And it is interesting that he left this early, but I can kind of understand. I actually read a little bit of the book called Cubs Way, about Theo Epstein going from, and it had parts of it where Theo Epstein went from the Red Sox to the Cubs, and he talked about how he really liked starting up that young core and having everything play out. And the Cubs are at this turning point where they might not win at all, and their core is really close to free agency. And he wants someone to take that and decide what to do with that core now. And that's what he's leaving up to Jed Hoyer, who he himself is a very great pick for GM. He deserves it. He was the assistant GM. Now he's the actual GM. He's the GM of the Padres. He was with Epstein in the Red Sox organization. So this is a very deserving position for him, and hopefully he'll lead the Cubs in the right direction.
Yeah, and that's good that the Cubs maybe aren't making too dramatic a move, the type of GM they're doing. I just find it really interesting that like how a lot of these analytical minds have gone with like the game of baseball with Epstein, for example. It's interesting that he's gone through a couple teams, and meanwhile you still have Billy Beane, who's still the other big analytical sabermetric mind, yet he's still with the A's. It's not official that he's left yet. I mean, it's looking like he's probably going to leave this season, but even that's not official yet. So it's interesting how like some of the guys switch teams a lot, but like some guys like Billy Beane are still with the team is one of the things I find kind of ironic about this whole thing.
Yeah, there are far and few GMs that last so long with an organization. Maybe the last 10 years, but they won't last 15 or 20. There's not too many Cashmans or Beans out there. And when you see someone as good as Theo Epstein, who pretty much left Boston on his own accord and went to Chicago and leave Chicago on his own accord, you don't see that. Usually you see them getting fired or changing house. But no, he left both times on his own accord. That's how much power he has. And he honestly could have had offers from teams like the Phillies as well, but he just wanted to kind of take a break. Maybe he's done with baseball. Maybe he just wants to take a year or two off. It's understandable. GM is one of the most demanding positions, especially in baseball. You essentially work a ridiculous shift, to say the least. You work probably 12 plus hours a day, especially during the trade deadline. They're up until the wee hours of the morning trying to get deals done. So to be the best at it in a very difficult sport to do that in, it's very impressive.
Oh yeah, for sure. And just the fashion in which he's done it, like breaking those World Series droughts of teams, bringing a whole new mindset of the GM position to baseball, making more towards the same metric sets. I mean, I don't know if we would be like so deeply ingrained in stats if it wasn't for guys like him and some of these other sabermetrics GMs who have like really brought that more to, who have really brought Bill James writings more to the forefront.
And this is why he'll be in the Hall of Fame. And you hardly hear of GMs in the Hall of Fame. I think the most recent one was Nate Sherholtz for the, or I might be botching his first name, but I know it was like Sherholtz for the Braves, and he was their longtime GM. And Epstein might be soon to follow if he calls it quits, or he might be one of the more notable ones. But that's because, again, he changed the game. He revolutionized the game. He brought in Bill James, as he mentioned. He changed the game with analytics. He was one of those guys alongside Billy Beane. So those two are, I feel like they're lockdown Hall of Famers.
Definitely.
And of course, speaking about the Hall of Fame ballot, we won't name every player on the list, but we also, instead we'll actually just go through different questions. And just overall, this ballot is one of the more weaker ones in recent years. So you've seen a lot more players get in. We've seen players such as Greg Maddux and Pedro Martinez and Derek Jeter and Randy Johnson and Chipper Jones and Ken Griffey, some of the most amazing superstars in the last 30 years or so get in and are just sure ballot Hall of Famers. But not this time, not this year. Probably the one maybe going the most could be, or most likely to get in, is Curt Schilling. Bonds and Clemens have a bit of a chance, and that's kind of it right now. There's maybe some people who can make the case later on, but this year it's pretty weak. Not that the talent isn't still very impressive, but there's a lot of borderline Hall of Famers.
Yeah, I'm feeling that these are great players, a lot of great players on the ballot. Don't get me wrong, they deserve to be recognized in the history of baseball. The problem is we have a lot of players on the cusp. Like, are they really great enough to get in when we dig deep into their stats? Were they really like that extra they have that extra special factor to get them into the Hall of Fame? And honestly, I mean, if I were to be honest, looking at this year's ballot, I'm thinking the two ones who would be the most likely, who obviously have that it factor, happen to be the two ones who are so controversial because of their steroid use, and which has been the one thing that's really blocked them at all from getting in the Hall of Fame. Other than that, none of the other guys, I feel like, maybe quite crack that for a lot of writer standards, which explains why there might not be any first timers getting in this year.
Exactly. There's so many controversial players on this ballot. Of course, Clemens and Bonds are controversial because they took PEDs, and baseball's had a difficult time allowing players with PEDs in there. They've only allowed Pudge, Rodriguez, and Jeff Bagwell in, but those were more suspicions. Everyone knows for sure that Clemens and Bonds did take PEDs. And then you have also Billy Wagner, who's a reliever, and that's still a controversial topic for the Hall of Fame about which relievers, only maybe the best two, which is the best two recent ones, such as Mariano Rivera and Trevor Hoffman. But should Billy Wagner be involved in that too? That's something to consider. And then other players who are just incredible on the ballot, such as Manny Ramirez, Gary Sheffield, Sammy Sosa. Those players also took PEDs, and they're not even close to really getting in either.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You point that out there. And then you also have players with like a lot of the character issues this year on the Hall of Fame too, and that's probably what's hampered some of them. Like, we're going to talk a lot about Curt Schilling. That's probably, if there's anything that's really hampered him from getting into the Hall of Fame at all the past few years, that probably has to be like the main factor, if I'm being honest. Like, and you could argue maybe even the same about guys like Jeff Kent, who I think is maybe a dark horse pick for the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, Kent's interesting too. When we do talk about him, we definitely have to mention his defense, of course, because he was not the most defensively laden second baseman. He kind of, all he did was hit homers, which is impressive because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he does have the most home runs for a second baseman all time, but he doesn't really offer as much besides that, and his WAR isn't as high as maybe some people would like. although he's still around the area of Ian Kinsler and Dustin Pedroia. So he is an interesting candidate, but it does seem like this year he may not get in just because he will be on his 9th year. He only got 27.5% last year. It would be a big stretch. I think the Hall of Famers that we really need to look at, of course, is Curt Schilling, who, as we've alluded to, Ben, he has his own controversy. He said suggestive things that may have been racist in the past, and he's been a Trump supporter, which, of course, the media is not happy about in any respect. So that will definitely hinder his case, and that's one of the biggest knocks against him, even though he's part of the elusive 3,000 innings, 3,000 strikeouts club and was one of the best pitchers in the 2000s. So that's what's hurting him, and he only has 70%, and that's still a little bit of a jump for him too.
Yeah, definitely for Schilling, but like seeing how his amazingness in both like the regular season and postseason, I'm kind of liking I kind of feel like it's just hard to deny him a trip to Cooperstown.
That honestly brings up an interesting question. So, should someone who is Hall of Fame worthy be rejected from the Hall of Fame because of his off-the-field actions? What do you think?
Well, when you look at the past Hall of Fame, I feel like Curt Schilling should be a no-brainer Hall of Famer in that sense, because we look at Ty Cobb and what he was like to the game, how he used to spike players on the field. He would play very dirty and all of that. Like there hasn't been a player, I don't think, who's brought any dirtiness to the field since Ty Cobb quite to that level, but he's in the Hall of Fame. So I'm starting to wonder what kind of standards baseball is holding guys to this day and age, and if they've like changed up the kind of standards they're holding them to. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think they are trying to take more of that social justice initiative a little bit. And I think that's really the only reason why they're holding back Curt Schilling. There's not too many reasons to keep him out of the Hall of Fame. So it's definitely been a part of the off-the-field antics that have taken him off. But at the end of the day, you should look at it. I think the Hall of Fame, they try to look at a player, everything that encompasses a player. For example, Mariano Rivera was just a good guy who was one of the greatest modern day closers in history, if not the greatest. And that's how he got in. Derek Jeter was the face of baseball for the vast majority of his career. He got in. And that's kind of what they look towards. Schilling does not have that persona. Barry Bonds does not have that persona. Jeff Kent does not have that persona. Neither does Roger Clemens. And the Hall of Fame looks at them as complete people. And because of that, they're taking them out. I don't think that should be the case. I think if a player is worthy of the Hall of Fame and they don't have PED scales, that's an entirely another topic, let them in. Unless it's something so atrocious. And I know that Schilling is controversial, but I don't think he's not like a Nazi or something like that. He's not, he's not like an outward racist, or he's still like, he's spoken poorly sometimes, but I don't think that's a reason to keep him out of the Hall of Fame.
Well, it's just kind of not been a reason in any sport if you think about that. And like I said, I mean, just compare him to some of the other guys in the game who have been inducted in. Ty Cobb, not a great, like I said, in the field, not a great guy, but also guys like even Ted Williams. I was reading a story about him. He was not the greatest father to his kids in a little story I was reading from the Great American Sports Writing. So it's, I would beg to differ with, I think, what Schilling's done, has said, and has gone way over the line, and it deserves some of that. It deserves a lot of the backlash it's getting, which I'm glad people are like standing up and not just ignoring it from Schilling. But it's, I really don't know to what extent, given the history of the game and history of most other sports Hall of Fames as well, what extent we can really keep him out of the Hall of Fame for that. But I definitely, which is why, getting to the next subject, I definitely think we're going to see a big increase for him. I think this year Curt Schilling will get enough of the increase to get in the Hall of Fame. Like, I think Bonds and Clemens will maybe get close to the 70%, but like But like, given that's their second to last year, and they'll see where baseball is going with the steroid scandal, they still have one more year, so I think they won't maybe quite get there this year. But I definitely see Schilling finally getting over the mark. What do you think about that?
Well, first off, I want to agree with you that no one should be happy with the things Schilling has said off the field, and that should be taken there. I'm happy that people are mentioning it. It just is more of the question of how much should we look at it, and how much should we judge a player's off the field actions, of course. But that being said, yeah, Schilling should get over the hump. It's a very weak ballot, one of the most weak ballots in the recent years, because usually we've been used to seeing 2 to 3 to 4 players get in, which is a lot for Major League Baseball. But this year, there's no standouts, as we've mentioned. Schilling might just get over the hump. I don't think he'll even get 80%. He might get around 76% or so. And as for Clemens and Bonds, they're not going to make it this year. They have a couple of years left, and it's been difficult for them to make a huge leaps and bounds. It's no Larry Walker case where he'll go from 13% to around 78% or so. That's not the case for them. That's going to be a slow rise, and I think they're a good threshold that they would look at is maybe 65% for them this year. If you get to that mark, that'd be pretty good for them. I don't know if they'll reach 70 though.
Yeah, I kind of don't exactly see that happening with 70. But then, and if they do reach 70, the big point I want to bring up is I think that's going to bring into question a lot of the integrity of the game of baseball in a lot of ways with some of their past decisions, because that's what I feel like that's why a lot of writers have held off voting those guys into the Hall of Fame. Is there's already been a lot of questions about the game's integrity. I mean, the inability to let the Astros all walk after this cheating scandal, and then but yet deny these guys a trip to the Hall of Fame kind of already put some of the game into integrity. But what I think is going to put the game of the integrity into even greater question is if they allow these guys in the Hall of Fame, but it's going to call for more demands for what I believe is long overdue to put these other guys, Pete Rose and Shoeless Joe Jackson, 2 other historic names that got kicked out of baseball for various reasons. Shoeless Joe Jackson obviously didn't, I don't think really took that much part in what he did, so he really didn't deserve to get kicked out of baseball. Pete Rose did what he did, but he admitted to it eventually. Overall, he was a great innovator to the game of baseball with everything he did. So those guys, if Barry Bonds and Clemens are suddenly deserving of the Hall of Fame for like actually doing something that affected their game in a lot of ways, it would be beyond me if baseball wouldn't then take the step to finally put Pete Rose and Shoeless Joe Jackson in the Hall of Fame. That needs to become a subject of discussion soon.
Well, the thing is, it's already been a subject of discussion, and with Rob Manfred taking over for Bud Selig, Pete Rose asked him, hey, can I be reinstated? And by reinstated, that means be up for the Hall of Fame. But because he's banned, the Hall of Fame and the Baseball Writers Association have no say in it. They have no say in letting in Joe Jackson either. They can maybe try to push for it, but they can't vote on him going in right now. So I think if Clemens and Bonds get in, that would open up the case for all the other PED users and how they should get in. I think it's already starting to crack a little bit when you have Bud Selig, the commissioner who saw all of that happen and do that on purpose, essentially, letting them all in or letting these players take PEDs because of the 1994 baseball strike, then it's pretty likely that they're moving towards that direction. Or Bagwell and Piazza and Pudge, who all had their own myriads with PED scandals. And it is likely that they possibly did take PEDs. So now it's just like, all right, all this evidence against Bonds and Clemens, if they get in, what parameters are we setting? And the thing is, there is no parameters that they are setting. This is the Hall of Fame, and it's just up to each writer, and there's not going to be a really official parameter either, and that's kind of the weird controversy about that as well.
Yeah, I'll agree with that there. I mean, kind of the lack of boundaries and the way they've evolved over time, there's never really been a good set parameters. Like if it was today's parameters, if Ty Cobb was I know I mentioned Ty Cobb a lot, but I just want to put him back in today's context. He probably wouldn't be in the Hall of Fame, seeing what they're doing. If it was up to today's writers, just seeing what he's just seeing what he was up to in his career. So it's just really, I mean, I feel like it's kind of hard to set a real standard for that kind of thing. And speaking of standards, I want to move on to the next subject with standards and numbers. If we see some of these guys who aren't the biggest names, like some of these first timers or some of these other guys on the ballot who are super borderline with the Hall of Fame get in, will that maybe decrease some of the standards moving forward in terms of some of the players who can get into the Hall of Fame? Do you have a thought on that?
Well, I think just with the players who took PEDs, and yeah, it would definitely help them out. Help controversial players such as we mentioned, Alex Rodriguez and Robinson Cano. And if maybe what you were alluding to, how if Clemens and Bonds get in, that allows for possible reinstatement of Pete Rose and Shoeless or Jackson, then maybe potential players in the Astros, such as Jose Altuve, who's making his own Hall of Fame case, or Justin Verlander, who is on that team as well. And I wonder if they will face less difficulties because these two got in. So that is interesting.
Yeah, and now so because of that, I think it's good that there's a few names I think we should watch closely for sure. And although they might not be like Hall of Famers this year, I think there's definitely some names on the line that could get in. One name in particular that I think actually does have, if anyone has a chance of also getting in with Schilling this year, it's Omar Vasquel. Very interesting case. I know his hitting stats were rather underwhelming, but obviously he was one of the greatest fielding shortstops of all time, which is basically what's bringing his case to the Hall of Fame. But I don't know, looking at some of Vasquel's stats and compare them to other great shortstops in the league who are in the Hall of Fame, I actually can make a good case for him being in the Hall of Fame. Because, like, for example, I'll just give an example. Ozzie Smith, one of the greatest fielding shortstops of all time, his hitting stats were almost relatively equivalent to that of Vasquel's. But when I look at Vasquel's stats in some areas, like I think his career batting average was a tad better than Ozzie Smith, his career OPS was like a tad better than Ozzie Smith. So actually, I would make a strong case that Omar Vasquel, maybe even this year, has done enough to get into the Hall of Fame.
Vizquel would have to make a big jump, though. He had 52.6% last year, so have to nearly make a 23% jump. But I agree with you, Ben. I think Vizquel is very deserving, and I think looking at Ozzie Smith is a great way to evaluate Vizquel because both of them have sub 700 OPSs, which is very weak for a hitter. Both of them had nearly 3,000 hits. Both of them were great fielders as well. So they're very similar players, and it is interesting because I don't know how, but maybe because of the stolen bases and the loss, but Ozzie Smith is almost double the amount of WAR that Vizquel has, and that's probably hurting him too. So, and WAR is really this overwhelming stat that Hall would love to look at, as well as Jaws, which Vizquel does not rank too highly upon, and that's probably what's hurting him, but it does look like he'll eventually make it, and he should have a pretty nice increase this year too. He should be able to get 60% or higher. And besides,
go ahead.
Oh, besides Vizquel, another really interesting player is Scott Rowland. And I'm honestly surprised that Rowland hasn't gotten in yet. He's not one of those third basemen who hit 500 homers and he's no Mike Schmidt, for example. He didn't hit 500 homers. He wasn't a great and didn't have like gold gloves along with that. He's 300 homers and also had gold gloves too. But he's one of the best third basemen in recent years, in the 2000s as well. And there's really little case to not put him in there. Even like WAR and Jaws wise, he still ranks very highly too.
Yeah, it was interesting. I actually didn't think about Scott Rowland as much of a Hall of Fame name. I saw him as a great player, but I didn't think of him as much of a Hall of Fame going into it. But then, I mean, looking at a lot of his stats and seeing what he did over the years for the Cardinals, I mean, he actually, or not for just the Cardinals, for all his teams in general, he actually has a higher batting average than a lot of these other players being considered. And so I actually So I actually think Scott Rowland was an all-around kind of underrated. I think part of it was he just didn't maybe have, because I don't remember. I remember following him throughout his career, but maybe he didn't have as much of that it factor that we saw of some of the other exciting players that have been inducted. Maybe that's part of it, because I never remember him really being the most talked about name in baseball, even among third basemen over the years, if I'm being honest.
And you're right about that. I guess if there is one knock on Scott Rowland, is that he was never the best third baseman in the league, but he was very consistent and always up there and would always provide great defense and usually above average offense as well. And I think there's a place in the Hall of Fame for players who have the it factor and also have the consistent factor too.
Yeah, I agree. I think we need to put more of. I think there's more of these guys may have somewhat of the consistent factor too in this year's thing. Maybe not as many of them have the it factor. So that's something else that I think the writers should definitely consider this year when they're voting on it.
And a couple other players who we should definitely watch closely who have that consistent factor are Mark Burley. And I would even go to say Tim Hudson too, because Burley had, I forget how many years it was, but it was at least 10 plus years of 200 innings plus. And that's incredible for the 2000s era. Few pitchers had that mark, and he had a great ground ball rate. Didn't strike as many batters, but reached over 3,000 innings and was just very consistent. He's one of these kind of throwback pitchers because you should watch Foolish Baseball. I know I always mention it, but he was essentially a speed runner. His games almost always finish under 3 hours. He even had a game almost finish under 2 hours, or was like or just finish under 2 hours. And he's just an incredible starter, incredibly consistent, always won 10 plus games throughout the majority of his seasons. Even his last year, he had like a 2.0 F4, so he should be in. And if you're going to let Burley in, you might as well let Tim Hudson in because his ERA is more than 0.3 lower than him, and he also is fair share of 200 plus inning seasons. So, I mean, both of those guys never had a Cy Young award-winning season, but they were consistent, and they got over 3,000 innings, which should be the new threshold.
No, look at their stats too. I mean, yeah, they both had actually relatively impressive whips for their time too. Like they both have, they both have similar whips. Hudson's actually better than Burley's. Of course, though, Burley, what gives him an advantage is he has a WAR at 59.1, and that's kind of huge with WAR because apparently the average WAR of pitchers is 60, so he's just kind of missing that average WAR mark, Burley. But yeah, I think Hudson was a great part. I mean, he really carried. Obviously, I knew him as a little before my time getting into the A's, but he carried like that A's big three pitching staff in the early 2000s. It seemed like he was maybe the most consistent of that big three: Hudson, Zito, and Mulder, which was huge. I mean, because they were like one of the scariest pitching attacks in baseball at the time. But yeah, he still continued to do pretty well in his years with Atlanta following that.
Yeah, he aged rather well, and that's definitely going to help him out because a lot of Hall of Famers kind of tail off after the 30s, but there wasn't as much the case for Burley and Hudson. And Burley and Hudson, of course, are these new first-time players who are on the Hall of Fame ballot. Another one that's very intriguing is Tory Hunter, who won a few Gold Gloves, was an All-Star for a few times, has over 300 home runs. He might get a decent look this year. He won't be first ballot Hall of Famer by any means, but he should at least rack up around 15 to 20%, if not more.
I think he should be a Hall of Famer at my point is what I'm arguing, because I think he was all around, besides being all around one of the most exciting and best center fielders perhaps of all time on the fielding front of things. He did win. I mean, he had a Silver Slugger award. He had some decent batting stats. I actually think he had some good consistencies throughout his career. So I actually really I think Tory Hunter is kind of a good underrated case for the Hall of Fame in my book, honestly.
He does have 300 plus homers, which help, but they usually like having that round number of 400. Another knock on him is his low on base percentage of 331 and being under an 800 OPS, which is pretty elite for baseball. He has had some knocks in his fielding, despite winning some Gold Gloves, and he also hit 30-plus homers just once. So I think he should be. I mean, I'm more lenient and favorable than, of course, the Hall of Fame is, and it seems like you feel that way too. But I can see where they have some knocks on him, of course.
Yeah, seeing another player that I think can have some knocks on him, and I think maybe could be another one again, is Todd Helton. I know that there's a lot of people saying that, like, oh, he was only really a home run hitter. Oh, he played at Coors Field. He was just another typical those power hitting first baseman in the air. But looking at his stats, actually, he had a relatively decent batting average too. Actually, better than a lot of other these hitters here. His career batting average was .316, and he had a higher career on base percentage than a lot of the other hitters of .414. So I actually think Todd Helton, and then you just saw what happened with Larry Walker last year. He was able to reach the threshold despite him having the same case playing at Coors Field all his career. I mean, you have to induct those guys in at some point. Don't just judge a ballpark in terms of guys' chances of getting in and taking away guys' value from getting in. I mean, they still have to play all those games on the road. I just think it's ridiculous to think, oh, he had this ballpark to his advantage to get in. And I think Todd Helton actually has a case to maybe get in the future too.
I've actually really warmed up to Helton. I kind of see him as Mr. Rocky, and that's pretty much the case since the Rockies have been around since '93, and he joined the Major League Ball Club in 1997. So he's definitely up there, and he also is more than just a Coors Field player. By weighted runs created plus and OPS plus, these advanced metrics that take into account the different ballparks that players play in, he's still a very above average hitter. And then he also had more walks and strikeouts, which is incredible for a power hitter of his caliber. And he also only struck out more than 100 times once throughout his career, which is incredible. He had nearly 600 doubles, had 25 fame because of that.
So I think you were cutting out there a little bit. What was that kind of the last thing you were saying?
Oh, all good. I was saying he's a surefire Hall of Famer at some point because of that, just because he's more than just a Coors Field type of player.
Yeah, no, definitely. Another player who I think is a dark horse, maybe sure Hall of Famer on that list there is Gary Sheffield, honestly, in my opinion. I know that Sheffield, people associate him with all that power and everything that he provided with that. And I think did he have steroid speculation? I think he may have had some too, but when I look at it, I mean, he actually stole a solid 253 bases too. So I think I think Gary Sheffield's another one of those players we could maybe see getting down the line out of this list of first timer kind of, or I don't know if he's a first time, but Gary Schiff. He's seventh timer. So maybe down in the next 3 years or something in his last years getting in.
I think if only Clemens and Bonds get in, like this year or the next 2 years, then you'll have a shot. But it's going to take a lot just because of where Sosa's at, where Sheffield's at, where Manny's at. And out of those three players, he might be the weakest out of all of them. Not that he wasn't a great player, even with PEDs. So that will be tough for him. But he could definitely get a boost. And another couple players who could get a boost this year are a couple of outfielders, Andrew Jones and Bobby Abreu. And Jones, according to Baseball Reference, is the greatest defensive center fielder in history. And his 10-year peak at the beginning of his career was just incredible. He was such a power hitter and could haul in any ball in the outfield. So he definitely deserves some credit for that. The last 10 years of his career weren't as good, but he still should get in. He still wasn't completely terrible. And then Bobby Abreu kind of just flows under the radar, does a little bit everything right, has a decent amount of home runs, a decent amount of speed, has 400 stolen bases, decent batting average, decent OPS, batting average around 291, OPS over 850. So he deserves some credit too. And I think he can at least get to like 15% this year.
Yeah, definitely. I think Bobby Abreu will get more of those votes. I think definitely a lot of these guys will see a leapfrog of their votes this year, like Bobby Abreu, Andrew Jones for sure.
Yeah, we could see that. And we have mentioned a lot of players tonight who could gain some percentages and also maybe even make the Hall of Fame, but we should also talk about the players who won't get in the Hall of Fame this year, the one and dones, as they like to call them. And players such as Mark Burley and Tim Hudson and Tory Hunter, those guys will be on the ballot for at least a few years, and hopefully they'll make some decent strides to get in. But players who won't get in will be players such as Barry Zito and Nick Swisher, Shane Victorino, LaTroy Hawkins, AJ Burnett, Michael Kadire, and Dan Herron. And they might not even receive a vote out of the people I mentioned. I think a couple first years who could receive a vote could be AJ Burnett and Erasmus Ramirez, who has 350 plus home runs. But even Ramirez doesn't really have too high of a WAR, just around the 30s, which is very low. So a lot of these guys might not make too big of a stride, probably will fall under that 5% threshold.
Yeah, I kind of have the same names down as you. I mean, I don't actually know about. I'm honestly those same names. I agree are kind of one and done. I think Zito maybe has a chance at getting one or a few votes because I mean, well, Zito he like had a half career, as we know, like in his days at the A's, he was so dominant. Obviously, part of that big three pitching staff, but then it just all kind of dwindled when he went across the bay to the Giants all those years. Except for he had that good 2012 year with the World Series. But other than that, kind of dwindled his career. But one thing he did that I think was remarkable is he as a lot of people enjoyed like watching. Like he brings something memorable, and I just wonder if like bringing something memorable to the game, even if the stats aren't like the best, is a qualifier for the Hall of Fame. Because what he brought memorable is he brought one of the greatest, still has one of the arguably the greatest curveballs up there as ultimate. He's up there with like Roy Halladay, Sandy Koufax as having perhaps arguably the greatest curveball of all time, which I mean is just one factor, but like a lot of fans admired that about him. He was a fun player to watch.
I certainly agree. And he also just released a book. I actually did a book review for it for Bat Sports page, and he just went through so many troubles throughout his career. He had so many hardships, and that's really kind of what led to his downfall. And you're right, he also really had an incredible career in his first half with the A's, and he was making 30-plus starts a year after his rookie season. From like 2001 to 2006, he had 200-plus innings pitched, and he was still a workhorse after that, still getting 30-plus starts, around 180-plus innings, and won a Cy Young Award in 2002. So he deserves a lot of credit for everything he went through, and perhaps he'll receive a down ballot vote.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting. I actually don't know. I mean, I think maybe Bobby Abreu, he was a good player across a lot of cylinders, but actually was his WAR as high though to be deserving of the Hall of Fame? That's my question. Like I feel like I don't know if Bobby Abreu is any more deserving necessarily than maybe Jeff Kent actually.
Well, Abreu had a 59.8 WAR, which is pretty decent. And then looking at Kent, I'll check him out too, but he also had around the same mark. So maybe Kent deserves more praise than I originally speculated. Because again, he was an elite offensive performer and one of the best offensive second basemen of all time.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, you have to look at the context of positions. Like even with the context for Hunter and Jones, I mean, both of them played center field, and I mean I feel like that's one position. I mean, although there are obviously a lot of great outfielders of all time, center field in particular hasn't been the position that's gotten the most attention, maybe generated the most in terms of like star Hall of Famers ever since like maybe Willie Mays or Mickey Mantle. I feel like there haven't been like a ton of like center fielders who have found their way to Cooperstown.
Yeah, there haven't been too many great center fielders coming recently, with the exception, of course, of Ken Griffey Jr. So I see what you mean there, and perhaps Jones and Hunter will receive a good amount of votes because of that. And just to start wrapping it up, Ben, if you had the choice to or if you were able to write in your own Hall of Fame ballot, which players would you put on it?
For this year's Hall of Fame, in terms of who I would want, or in terms, because it's the thing is, I mean, there's so many of the guys I want but aren't, but like realistically speaking would be, and you kind of want me to give who I'd want more, or who I'd kind of.
Let's start with who you want to get, and then we'll talk about who will get in.
The guys I really want to get, I mean, I want Schilling as much as I've kind of come to despise. There's a lot of baseball guys. I want Vasquel, obviously, Kent, Hudson, Bonds and Clemens finally. Billy Wagner is another one I think has done it. Todd Helton, I think Tory Hunter, and then Scott Rowland are the ones I really want to get. And then if I were to put two guys in the Hall of Fame, now I'll go to the other question. Put guys in the Hall of Fame this year, I would put in Schilling, Bonds and Clemens, even though some people think they need another year. I think Bonds and Clemens, and then I would also put in Vasquel. I think Vasquel's cracked the mark this year, even though that's kind of an unpopular opinion.
Mm-hmm. We do agree in a lot of the list that we created. For example, for me, I have Schilling, Rowland, Wagner, who we didn't get to as much tonight, but he's really up there, some of the greatest relievers of all time, and in the 21st century as well, along with Mariano Rivera and Trevor Hoffman. And he was really the strikeout artist before these new relievers came in, just started throwing 100. So he was the guy who did it first, essentially. Then I have Jeff Kent, Andrew Jones, Omar Vasquel, Bobby Abreu, Todd Helton, Barry Bonds, and Roger Clemens. I do believe that the Hall is incredibly tough, incredibly stingy, and for that reason, I just have Schilling getting in. But I do believe that Vasquel, Bonds, and Clemens will make a run for making the Hall this year.
Yeah, it's gonna be really interesting to see at the Cooperstown, and also down the line, because I feel like down the line you're going to start having a little more stronger players. Maybe classes this year kind of just came with like maybe a historically not as strong class as like we've had to choose from, like you said, in recent years. But even in a few years down the line, I'm excited to see some of the future, some of these other Hall of Fame guys like who have been more recent retirees, or all these current players who I think are already first ballot Hall of Famers are still playing. Yeah,
there will be some exciting candidates such as CC Sabathia, such as Carlos Beltran, I guess Lance Berkman was already on the ballot list, but a lot of these players who really could make a run for the money, then even more down the road, Dustin Pedroia, Miguel Cabrera, Albert Pujols. So the next 10 years or so, we could really see some fascinating ballots.
For sure. Yeah, it should be great to watch. And it's going to be fun to see how the Hall of Fame kind of shakes up the state of baseball in the future. And baseball's got a lot going on for it coming up. We have potential labor war potential little labor war coming this next off season with the collective bargaining agreement. It's not certain when this next season is going to start either. So I think the Hall of Fame and seeing baseball honor some great players will be a nice, regardless of who they are. I still think it can be a nice little refresher for baseball fans these next few weeks.
I agree, and that's a very good point you made, because obviously the labor negotiations aren't going to be ending anytime soon. So it's nice to have something consistent like the Hall of Fame, and something to get excited about too, especially after the MLB awards this season and now the Hall of Fame. It might be a couple of quiet months until people get in, because the hot stove might be cooling down and a lot of teams are only trying to get 1-year deals. So hopefully it'll get more interesting, continue to be interesting, but we'll always find something to talk about too. And on that note, thank you all for tuning in to the Velo podcast. We hope you have a wonderful week, and until next time.